Good afternoon. My name is Ismo Kokko and I'm an advisor for collective bargaining here at SAK in Helsinki, Finland. SAK is the biggest workers' federation, and we do have roughly 900,000 persons, and then 17 member unions. And when it comes to collective bargaining, we have roughly little under 200 collective agreements. And we have a pretty long history. We are about 110 years old, and the first collective agreements were made in the beginning of the last century. When it comes to collective bargaining, we have two principal laws. First is Working Contract Act, which sets really the basics concerning the relationship between the worker and the employer. And perhaps the most important one is the Collective Bargaining Act, which then sets the rules for collective agreements and what type of formalities you should consider when making collective agreements. And basically the bargaining and making agreements, there's two autonomous parties. The employer side. Employer side can be an association or a single employer, but the employees, they have to have an association, which is usually a union, although it can be a local one, but most of our collective agreements are made at the sectoral level. And when there's free autonomy, the idea is that the basic rules are set in the legislation, but it's fairly free for the parties to deviate from the legislation. And next, something about the actual technique. The Finnish legislation, when it concerns working life, it has three types of statutes. The first one is enforcing, which you cannot deviate from. Then there's semi-dispositive, which means that you can deviate by national collective agreement. And then there's dispositive legislation, which means that you can deviate the legislation at the personal level. And the most important one is, of course, the collective bargaining possibilities. And we need those possibilities because all the sectors are different. And the idea is, of course, to take into account the different needs and goals of the different sectors or industries. And so we might have slightly different terms of employment, but still through legislation we have the basics. For instance, that we do have a 40-hour working week, and basically the terms of the annual holidays are the same, but you can deviate by a collective agreement. And then one Finnish sort of speciality is generally binding collective agreements, aka erga omnium. That means, or the history is that in the 60s, beginning of 70s, there was a lot of discussion going on in Finland. Should we go through collective agreements and somehow try to, make them to consider everybody, or should we go through legislation? And then the question was resolved by erga omnium. And it means that if at a certain sector or certain industry, the companies that are members of the employer association, if they employ at least 50% of the workers, then the collective agreement can be considered as generally binding. And how we do it, in the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, there's a certain body that is making these decisions which collective agreement is generally binding or not. There's other criteria as well. The secondary criteria is that if there's over 50% of the workers at a certain industry belong to the union that has signed the collective agreement, that can also be considered as generally binding. And the third one is that if there's a long established collective agreement sort of culture in that industry, it can be considered also as generally binding, but that's quite rare. So organizing is the basis for good collective agreements. And well, this is only like 10 minutes, but the whole idea why we have done these agreements over 100 years in Finland is that by bargaining and by making an agreement, it's a win-win situation. It means that everybody basically can have a good wage, good terms of employment, and therefore they can probably have a good future and the possibility to make a living from the wage they get from work. And also for the employer, for the companies, it makes a certain a stable environment to make business, and there's no really quick changes, because if you regulate the working life through legislation only, you probably end up in a situation where there's a parliament election, and however the political situation is, there might be some election promises that, for instance, say that we can pay bigger minimum wages or lower minimum wages or some other way change terms of employment pretty quickly. But when you do it through collective bargaining, it usually lasts for decades, and there's a mutual interest to develop those agreements in the long term, and making Finnish working life and also Finnish business life better for everybody. But this is my contribution. Thank you, and everybody have a good seminar. Thank you.